So I'm going to talk mainly about taxes on food and soft drinks, looking at experiences in the European Union. As you've just heard, it's not always very easy to predict how people are going to respond to taxes on food and soft drinks, because everybody needs to eat food and needs to drink something at least. And what governments are trying to do when they introduce these taxes is to reduce people's overall calorie consumption, and you inevitably are going to end up substituting one source of calories for another. There's no guarantee that you will actually consume fewer calories overall. And there are all sorts of different effects, substitution effects, that can take place which undermine the health purpose of the policy. This was shown very interestingly in Denmark several years ago, when the Danish government introduced a tax on saturated fat. This affected all food products which had a certain amount of saturated fat in them. It was, I think, a genuine health tax. It wasn't just a way of making more money. We know that because when the fat tax came in, income tax was reduced. So there was no intention to get more tax overall. They just wanted to reduce the income tax level, make that more competitive, and they were looking for other areas, other things to tax, and they thought, why not saturated fat? It's not particularly good for you. If you've got to tax something, tax things that aren't good for people. And there was a computer model which said that this policy could lead to 3,800 extra years of life across the entire Danish population. Sounds quite a lot. It's actually only 5.5 days per person. How you calculate these things, I'm not too sure. But it was expected to have some beneficial effect on people's health. What actually happened? First of all, it affected very high fat products, most as you would expect, so things like butter and some cooking oils, olive oil for example, those prices rose quite a bit. What this chart here shows is that there was quite a big difference in the amount that prices changed in different stores. In the cheaper discount stores, the prices actually tended to rise more than in the supermarkets, but what you see is that prices rose more than what you would expect. The blue line shows what you would expect to see happen based purely on the value of the tax. The green line shows how much supermarket prices changed, which tended to be slightly more than the rate of the tax, and the other two lines, particularly the red line, shows you the discount stores where prices rose even more. And this is actually quite typical of what happens when these kind of taxes are introduced. Very often, either the manufacturer or the retailer, or both, will take the opportunity to put the price up a bit more and actually end up making more money from it. And the discount stores were able to do that more than the supermarkets because their prices were always lower. And one of the effects that we saw in Denmark is that as a result of the tax, more people went to the cheapest shops, the discount stores, fewer people went to the supermarkets, and the discount stores actually made the most money out of it. In terms of the consumption of saturated fat, what you see, the blue line shows the introduction of the tax. What you see here is a very sharp spike in consumption just before the tax came in. There was a very significant amount of hoarding of food. People would go out and buy lots of the most fatty products, store them in their fridges and kitchens, and as a result of that, as soon as the tax came in, you saw a bit of a dip in consumption. But that was really just people eating the food that they'd been storing up beforehand. And very quickly afterwards, you see a rise in consumption. It went more or less back to where it was before. There were various effects that were well documented at the time, which ultimately led to the fat tax being repealed. It came in October 2011. There was a vote to repeal it 1 year later, and it was finally repealed in January 2013. So it was only in place for 15 months, and that's for various reasons. Initially, it was quite popular. People thought it was worth trying. I think about 90% of politicians voted for it. but a year later about 90% of politicians voted to get rid of it. It had become very unpopular. Some of those reasons include people going into Germany and even into Sweden, depending where they lived, to do their shopping for donuts and bacon and butter and so on. Because of the differential tax rates on alcohol and tobacco, it's quite common for there to be a lot of cross-border shopping from Nordic countries into the south. But this exacerbated it. As well as buying alcohol, they would also go and buy fatty foods. That, of course, led to less business in Danish shops, and it led to essentially an opportunity cost, really, for people. It was people were making what were essentially unnecessary journeys just to save money. There was, as I've already said, a shift not only to cheaper shops, but also to cheaper brands. And this is something you see a lot with food and drink taxes. Because there is a big difference in price very often between premium brands and budget brands, people will be often very tempted simply to buy a cheaper brand rather than to reduce their consumption of that particular product. That is worth bearing in mind, in particular when we're talking about soft drink taxes, because the price of things like Coca-Cola and Pepsi is often much higher than it would be from a supermarket brand of what is essentially the same product. The tax itself led to inflation. Remember, this was 2011, 2012, the time when the economy around Europe was doing quite badly anyway. Inflation rose to, I think, 4.7%. The tax thereby was blamed on raising the cost of living for everybody, but also, in particular, raising the cost of living for people on low incomes, and so the tax was widely seen as being regressive. And again, this is something that is common to nearly all sales taxes of this sort. They will tend to take more wealth from the poor than from the rich as a proportion of their income. So it's very unusual for these kind of taxes not to be regressive. And that led the tax to being quite unpopular with the left-wing political parties, centre-left parties in particular in Denmark, and again was one reason it was repealed. And then there were the administrative costs of actually bringing in the tax. It's estimated that around about 10% of the total amount of revenue brought in by the tax was spent on bureaucracy of introducing it. And when you start thinking about what this tax was, it's easy to see why. This was a tax, as I say, on any product which had a certain proportion of saturated fat in it. How then do you work that out? Do you work it out before it was cooked, after it was cooked? Well, you have to really work it out after it was cooked, so it's no use knowing how much fat was put into the product. You need to work out how much fat is in the product when it's finished. And you're doing this with thousands and thousands of products, and it has to be checked by the government. And worst of all, perhaps, it then has to be applied to every product coming into Denmark from all these other countries. So these other producers also have to go through this administrative nightmare. So it was very burdensome on the food industry and also to a lesser extent on the government. But it created a kind of deadweight loss whereby there was a lot of time and money being put into simply working out what the tax rate should be on thousands of different products. So those were the economic factors. In terms of the health impact, because it wasn't in for very long, it's really quite difficult, in all honesty, to estimate what the health impact was. We know that the consumption impact was fairly limited, that there was a reduction of a few percentage points in the consumption of things like butter and high-fat cooking oil, and that there was, by the same token, a rise in consumption of lower-fat cooking oils and margarines. But even that was quite minimal, and it's therefore unlikely that it would have any real effect on either obesity or heart disease, particularly since it was only in force for a little over a year. There has been one or two studies, this perhaps is the best of them. It basically found that there was a pretty trivial change in consumption, that the fatty foods, sale of the fatty foods fell by just under 1%, and that they, in this particular study, they looked at ischemic heart disease, and depending on which of their hypotheticals they looked at, either it rose very, very slightly or it fell very, very slightly. I think it's fair to conclude that it really had no effect whatsoever on heart disease, which I guess was the primary indicator that the tax was aimed at. And so the tax was repealed, and the income tax went back up, and the saturated fat tax was abandoned. At the same time, actually, the government also announced it would be cutting tax on beer, and that it would be abandoning a tax on sugar, which it had in mind, but it decided that the negative consequences associated with the fat tax would probably be replicated with the sugar tax. So they abandoned that idea, and although many people around the world had been looking at Denmark to see how this tax went, to use it as a model for other taxes elsewhere, it was clearly not a success, and there were various commentators at the time who said this was probably going to be the high watermark now of these kind of attempts to change people's eating habits using the tax system. But of course that hasn't turned out to be the case. These are the food policies in place around the EU. This is from the Nanny State Index, which I edit. And in general, actually, I think we're probably at quite early days in terms of the introduction of policies aimed at reducing obesity or improving health by changing the price of food and soft drinks. As you can see, a large number of countries have zero across the board, so they have no policies in place. The policies here, taxes being a big one. Hungary has a large number of taxes on food and soft drinks and energy drinks. A handful of other countries have some form of tax, either on energy drinks or soft drinks, including diet drinks, actually, in some countries like France. Some of them have some fairly minor restrictions on what food can be sold in vending machines, mainly in schools. There are some restrictions on energy drink sales to children. There are some restrictions on food advertising, but not really very much. But generally, actually, there isn't a huge amount of regulation in this area. But it is just, there's more of it this year than there was last year, put it that way, and there will be more next year, I think, than there is this. Soft drink taxes are currently the main policy area that governments are looking at. Anything that involves taxes is usually going to be of interest to governments. In Europe, we have Belgium, Finland, France and Hungary already have some form of soft drink tax in place. Ireland, Portugal and the UK have a tax ready to go over the course of the next 12 months. Estonia is considering it. A few other countries are considering it. Bulgaria and Spain were going to introduce one. Spain was going to begin in the next few months, but in the end they abandoned it, largely because of the effect it was likely to have on the poor. But yeah, we will soon be in a situation where 7 or 8 countries probably have taxes on soft drinks. The justifications for them are, of course, to reduce consumption of the soft drinks, which that is bound to happen to some extent, as you've already seen with the previous presentation. Price goes up, consumption will fall to some extent, almost certainly. That reduction in consumption is hoped to lead to a reduction in obesity. That is much more difficult to establish. We'll come to that in a moment. To raise revenue, of course it will raise revenue, although there is likely to be a decline in consumption. The reality is that most consumers, most of the time, will not change their behaviour, and so taxes on products which have inelastic demand will always be quite reliable revenue raisers, unless there are ways for people to get around it, which in practice means going elsewhere to do your shopping. And that's what we've seen in a couple of cities in America recently. Berkeley in California and Philadelphia have introduced city-wide taxes, which of course are very easy to avoid in a country where nearly everybody has a car and you do your shopping by car. You just go out of town and you do all your shopping there and save money on your soft drinks. And an added justification that's been raised in Britain in particular is that this tax is designed to encourage industry to reformulate their products, in the case of soft drinks, to take out the sugar and replace it with artificial sweeteners. and that this is going to be an encouragement to doing that. So the UK campaign for a soft drink tax, it was announced last year by the Chancellor at the time, George Osborne, and in part it was a response to a mounting campaign. There's an organisation called Action on Sugar, it was formed 2 years earlier. Sugar is the new tobacco. This is a newspaper headline. It's the biggest selling newspaper in Britain. This is one of the many press releases of Action on Sugar turned into a news story. So there's been a lot of concern and panic about sugar in general, but about sugar in soft drinks in particular. David Cameron, the previous Prime Minister, brought in quite a few paternalistic policies in various lifestyle areas. But in reality, the tax came in principally because there had been not as much success with the economy as the Chancellor had hoped. He had not managed to cut the deficit by as much as he had predicted and promised. And so while delivering his budget in 2016, he needed something to pull out of his pocket to take away attention, really, from the other economic news. And so he brought up the sugar tax, which was not expected. And so it became quite a big news story and really covered his blushes at a time when his financial policies did not seem to be working as well as he had told us that they would. He also portrayed it as a tax on business. This goes back to the idea that these kind of taxes are there to incentivize industry to change their products. So he actually said that this is a tax on corporations and that the corporations won't need to pay it. It's entirely avoidable, it's entirely optional, they just need to take the sugar out of their drinks. This is somewhat disingenuous. It's akin to saying that alcohol duty is a tax on the beer industry, and if the beer industry wants to avoid it, they should just take the alcohol out of the beer. They could do that, and they could call it alcohol-free beer, but clearly it would be a very different product, and beer essentially would have been abolished. Sugary drinks do exist. A lot of people like sugary drinks, and if the soft drink industry took all the sugar out of them, they would no longer exist. The other thing about the reformulation here is that of all the sectors of the food and drink industry, the one part of it which has done more to reformulate their products than any other is actually the soft drink industry. And they've been doing it since the 1960s. There have been Diet Cokes and Diet Pepsis around for decades. Nobody can really argue that people are in some way coerced or manipulated into buying the sugary varieties. In fact, the big soft drink companies tend to promote their sugar-free versions a lot more than they do the sugary versions. They're advertised in much the same way, they're on the same shelves, they're at the same price. So it seems to me, looking at it from an economic point of view, that people do have totally free choice in this area, and if you're happy making that sacrifice of taste, which for many people switching from a sugary drink to an artificially sweetened drink is a sacrifice. If you're happy to make that sacrifice in order to consume fewer calories, it's a perfectly rational decision. If, on the other hand, you would rather have a sugary drink than consume fewer calories, apart from anything else, you might not actually need to consume fewer calories. Most people are not obese. That also is a rational choice. But it was portrayed rather disingenuously as a tax on business. It is, of course, as all sales taxes are, ultimately a tax on consumers. So we have various policies, taxes on food and soft drinks. As I say, taxes on soft drinks seem to be on the rise. Taxes on food, actually, if anything, are on the decline. Finland had a number of taxes on various forms of food, but actually repealed several of them at the start of this year. Denmark, as I say, repealed theirs. I won't go into the details here because it's fairly obvious if the tax goes up, you're going to see an increase in price. Generally, that increase in price will be in excess of what the tax is. Not always, but quite often. And similarly, I won't go into too much detail about consumption because it's already been covered. Basically, it's unpredictable. It depends about a lot of other things going on in the economy, whether wages are going up or down, what's happening with inflation, what the general demand is for these products and how elastic or inelastic people's demand is. So it's not saying a great deal to say that you put a tax on something, the price will generally go up and consumption will generally go down. The real question, and what these taxes are ostensibly designed for, is what effect they have on obesity. Most of the research in this area comes from America, where most states do have some form of tax on soft drinks. This study from Jason Fletcher and colleagues found that these kind of taxes did not have any effects on obesity. This is looking at children and teenagers. And the reason for that is that people simply consume different products which have a similar number of calories in them. Milkshakes, fruit juices, for adults, beer, are all relevant substitutes that people do switch to. Another study also found that there did not appear to be any effect on body weight from these kind of taxes. However, it did mention that actually a lot of these taxes in America are quite low. This is before Berkeley and Philadelphia brought in rather higher taxes, which have not really been assessed by academics yet. And these particular researchers suggested that we look at the highest taxes to see if they have an effect. That was then done the following year, and again, they were unable to find any impact. Again, for the same reason, substitution patterns in response to soda taxes that offset any caloric reductions in soda consumption. There has more recently been evidence from Mexico. Mexico introduced a 10%, roughly 10% tax on sugary drinks. Mexico, of course, is a significantly poorer country than any of the EU countries or America, and so you might expect it to have more of an impact. Possibly it did. It certainly has been claimed to have an impact. This is a study, I don't know how well you can see it. This study said that within the first year there was a 6% reduction in soda consumption, rising to about 12% amongst low-income groups, which quite honestly seems to me fairly plausible. It was a 10% increase in tax in a poor country after all. However, this was actually only based on a model, so it wasn't 6% drop in consumption per se, it was 6% less than the model suggested might have been sold in the absence of the tax. And the study itself was produced by people who were very strong advocates of the tax. So there was a certain amount of garbage in, garbage out there. As I say, you can see from the graph that consumption was falling in any case before the tax, and it has been falling actually in most countries, quite steeply in countries like America and Britain. So who really knows what would have happened in the absence of the tax? Doesn't seem to me implausible that it would have an effect, but it certainly doesn't seem to be a very dramatic effect. And shortly after that study was published, Mexico's National Institute of Public Health, which again is a strong advocate for the tax, actually published how many sugary drinks people were actually drinking, and it showed that in the period before the tax came in, people were drinking an average of 160 litres per head, which is a lot. Mexico is one of the biggest consumers of sugary drinks in the world. Then in 2014 it was 162 litres per capita. The tax came in and it was 161. We're talking very trivial differences in people's actual consumption. You can, if you wish, say that without the tax it would have gone up to 165, 166. You know, there's no way of arguing against a counterfactual like that. But clearly the idea that there is going to be any kind of significant weight loss as a result of the tax when people are basically drinking the same amount of sugary drinks as they have in recent years does seem to be extremely optimistic. And we shall wait and see what happens in Philadelphia and Berkeley, but the early evidence seems to be that there's been a lot of not even cross-border shopping, just out-of-town shopping, very easy to avoid. I read this week that the Philadelphia tax has brought in a lot less money than it was expected to. The tax in Philadelphia, by the way, also affected diet drinks, so it wasn't really a sugary drink tax. Same in Belgium, I think, certainly the same in France. It was going to be the same in Spain. I think this gives the game away that this is not really the money was going to be ring-fenced to use for some form of children's services. In Britain, the money is ring-fenced, supposedly, to go towards school breakfasts for children and school sports. So usually these taxes are portrayed as raising money for a good cause, if you like, and there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, you've got to raise money somewhere. It's not necessarily worse to raise it from a tax on saturated fat or sugary drinks or bacon or whatever. I mean, you can point at anything and tax it. The question is, what is the impact of that? I would suggest to you that unless the taxes are very, very high and very, very broad, which is to say covering every other form of substitute, so for example, not just sugary drinks, but also milkshakes and fruit juices and anything else that contains a significant number of calories, I doubt you're going to see any measurable effects on obesity, let alone on obesity-related health outcomes. The basic economic evidence so far shows that, as you might expect, the demand for food and drink per se is basically totally inelastic. Demand for certain food and drink products, the elasticity depends very much on the kind of foods available and what the substitutes available are. But there are very significant substitution effects that take place. Again, it depends where you are, how rich your people are, how much they like the product. But certainly in a relatively small country like Denmark, which has a free market with all the countries around it, there are significant opportunities for cross-border shopping. In a city like Berkeley, California, there are very significant opportunities. There are always opportunities for people to go to cheaper shops and buy cheaper brands, and if they do that, you immediately undermine most, if not all, of the supposed health benefits that come from these kind of taxes. The policies themselves tend to be politically unpopular. Most people in Mexico, according to survey evidence, are against the use of taxes in this way. And one reason that they're unpopular is that they are almost invariably regressive. And that was probably the main reason why political opinion changed so dramatically in Denmark in the space of a year. When the tax was first proposed, there was only the Danish Communist Party and the Danish Classical Liberal Party that were opposed to it. By the end of it, nearly every party was officially opposed to it. And as yet, there is no evidence that any kind of taxes on food and drink have actually reduced obesity. Indeed, there's no evidence that any policies have as yet reduced obesity. There are only two countries in recent years that have seen a reduction in obesity. One of them is North Korea, the other one is Venezuela. Going a bit further back, Cuba saw a similar effect when the Soviet Union collapsed and the money dried up there. But I think there actually is a lesson in the fact that places like Venezuela, where the economy has gone completely backwards, the fact that these are the only countries that have seen a reduction in obesity tells you how difficult it is in an affluent, successful country to affect people's eating and drinking habits to such an extent that they actually lose weight. And to do that deliberately rather than accidentally, as has happened in Venezuela, I think is a very tall order indeed, because people do care very much about what they eat. They are prepared to make sacrifices in other parts of the household budget before they cut down and change their diet fundamentally. And I think that's all from me. I don't know how much time we have for any questions.
I will do questions later.
How are we doing? Okay. Are we done for time? Am I on time?
Yeah.
Yeah, great.
Thank you very much, Christopher.